In America, the Caribbean, and around the world, we are in the midst of a great recession. The International Monetary Fund is considered the world's central bank. In the 80s, the 90s, they were highly criticized all over the world for bad prescriptions to many of the problems that face the developing countries. Now, in this new crisis, the developed countries are affected, and many people are asking, what is the new role of the International Monetary Fund? Carib nation. We are now experiencing astronomical figures with unemployment. People are losing their jobs in this great recession. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, is one of the major players in terms of prescribing solutions to the problem of unemployment and to the great financial crisis that has occurred and is occurring presently in the world. Today in our studio, we have two eminent guests. One is Mark Weisbrot. He is the co-director of the Center for Economic Policy and Research. He is well known in America and around the world for his views on what should be the solutions and the policies to the problems we face today. And we also have with us Prakash Lungani, advisor to the research department at the International Monetary Fund, who has been engaged in dealing with the question of job creation. Gentlemen, welcome to our studio.
Thanks, Bob.
And thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I will start, first of all, can you characterize to us a bit about what is this great financial crisis and the Great Recession, so that people in the street, ordinary citizens, can understand what this is really, what is this crisis about?
Well, I guess I wouldn't really call it a financial crisis. I mean, there was a financial crisis that led up to the world recession of 2009, but that part was temporary. And what you had really was a world recession, and the economy is recovering now. The world economy is recovering, but kind of unevenly, and it's kind of a weak recovery in a lot of countries, and not enough to create employment. For example, in the United States, it's barely enough to lower the unemployment rate. And the European recovery is weak as well. And it varies in different regions of the world. The main problem now in terms of coming out of it is you have to have sufficient aggregate demand. And you don't have that in the United States, and for example, to really lower the unemployment rate. You don't have that in Europe. And in a lot of these countries, especially the high-income countries, you have what we would call pro-cyclical policies, where the economy is weak and the government, which has to really make up for the private demand, is going in the wrong direction, like our state and local governments are doing here, for example. They're cutting spending, raising taxes, in some, and that in a situation where the economy is either weak or contracting, and that is, I think, one of the biggest threats to the world economy.
Prakash, Mark speaks about the bubble, and I know you did research previously on the housing. Right. So I imagine he's referring to the housing crisis.
Yes, and he's
Can you link
right.
it to strengthen what Mark is saying?
No, I think I agree completely with what he said. I think one of his colleagues, Dean Baker, was prescient in warning about the housing bubble in the U.S., and it's happened all over the globe, and I think we are seeing the aftermath of the bursting of those bubbles, not just in the U.S., but in Europe and in many other countries. And I agree with him completely that the recovery is not a strong one, and our managing director has said that the recession should not be called over until unemployment starts falling.
Well, this is one of the questions, Mark. This story that we are getting out of the recession. I don't understand how we are getting out of the recession and unemployment is rising. So who is getting out of the recession?
Well, do you mean in the United States, for example?
U.S. and around the world.
Well, it is different in different countries.
Okay, let's say with the U.S. for a start.
Yeah, in the U.S., well, the thing is, growth would have to be a lot faster. You need probably 3.5% growth in the United States just to keep the unemployment rate from rising. And, you know, in the recovery from the worst recession we had before this, which was 1980 to 82, when you came out of that recession, you had much faster growth than what we have now. And that's how the unemployment rate came down. That's how Ronald Reagan got reelected.
Yeah.
And you don't have that kind of growth now. I think that's really the main thing. It isn't a question like you often see that, you know, banks aren't lending or credit is too tight. It's just the demand isn't there because the growth is not fast enough.
So Prakash, from the IMF perspective, how did the U.S. move out of this?
I mean, I think that one has to tackle the problem of lack of jobs more directly. I mean, you have to have more targeted programs that are trying to create jobs. I mean, it would be good if, as Mark said, you could do it on the basis of aggregate demand. I think in most recoveries, that is
and
the
for our
normal.
listeners, what is aggregate demand?
Well, if you think about what creates jobs is when companies start hiring people. So, you know, the jobs is a derived demand. When companies feel confident and they want to produce more, they hire more people. So, unfortunately, we don't seem to be at the point where companies are confident enough, are feeling confident enough to actually go out and hire lots of people, which is what happens generally at the end of recessions. So I think you need to boost aggregate demand to the extent that you can. And I think that the Fed, through its quantitative easing and through the fiscal policy to the extent that it can, is trying to do that. And I think other countries as well, to the extent that they can boost demand through their policies, they're trying to do so. But I mean, through their policies, I mean through their monetary and fiscal policies, through their macro policies. But if that does not prove to be enough, you have to think more directly of how you can
how do you
try
really
to create jobs.
Get investors to want to create jobs? In the developing world, the argument was that we have to make the country suitable for investors, attractive for investors. A few weeks ago, President Obama spoke to the rich CEOs and said they had trillions of dollars available that they should invest. How do you move them from just giving them a speech to invest to making them invest? Why wouldn't they want to invest in China or invest in India where labor, is being paid $1 a day?
I'm afraid it is simpler than most people are making it. And I think what Prakash said was correct, but I think to add to it a little is these companies don't want to invest because they can already satisfy existing demand and even more with the capacity that they have. So in order for them to want to expand, they have to have more demand. There has to be more spending. And consumers were hit. You know, when $8 trillion of wealth disappears, and there were stock market losses as well, and real estate, you know, the construction sector, of course, both commercial and residential, took big hits. That is a huge reduction, and at this point, it can only be made up by the government. And that's where, you know, our fiscal policy has been much too weak. The whole stimulus that we had, if you take off the state and local spending and taxing that went in the wrong direction, it was maybe 1/8 the size of what you would have needed in the last 2 years just to make up for the cutbacks in spending that you get from the bursting of the housing bubble. Okay? So that's just too small. It's a quantitative thing.
When the financial crisis hit the United States, the first reaction of George Bush was to call a meeting. He summoned a meeting of the G7 countries, the developed industrialized countries. But a few months afterwards, quickly, they shifted to convoking a meeting with the G20 countries, expanding it, saying that the rich developed countries alone cannot offer solutions to the crisis. Why was this shift from G7 to G20? What happened in this crisis that explains that?
Well, the explanation is that this is a process where the developing countries have been demanding a seat at the table. You know, the IMF is run by the US Treasury Department with some input from Europe, basically. You know, it's completely dominated by the rich countries. The World Trade Organization was written much later. You know, the IMF and the World Bank were in 1944. In 1995, the World Trade Organization was formed, and that had at least a consensus process. But the rules were very much stacked in favor of the rich countries. Those rules wouldn't even be accepted today if they were put to a vote, as they were in 1995 in the various countries. And so the problem with the G20 is now we have a seat at the table for countries, you know, not just the richest countries now. You have Brazil and India and China, as you mentioned. But you don't have the real power. The real power is in the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization. Those are the organizations, and of course you have the UN Security Council. All of those are still dominated by the same powers that ran the world after World War II. And that is a problem. That's why you have a continuing kind of colonial relationship in international economic relations.
Prakash, you believe there's been a shift? Or?
I do think there's been a shift. I think that has been one of the good things that has come out of this recession. Lots of human misery and suffering, of course, but if you can point to a ray of light, it is the fact that, as Mark said, the power has started shifting. So it was our managing director who went to Davos in February 2008 and called for a fiscal stimulus, not just in the US, but he said one that is coordinated across the globe because we are facing a global problem. And then after he made that call, the G20 sort of came together and that became the agency.
But Mark is saying they have a seat at the table, but like China, India, and Brazil, but they really don't have.
No,
really
I don't think that is true at all. If you look at the top 10 shareholders of the IMF today, after the reforms that are going to be put in place over the next couple of years, the top 10 shareholders of the IMF are going to be the top 10 countries of the world in terms of their GDP. What else would you want? So you would have the G7 without Canada. So you have the G6 plus the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China. You know, that is how the world happens to be at the moment. You know, you have the 10 richest countries and they are going to be the 10 biggest shareholders of the IMF. So I think there has been a shift. It should continue as countries grow richer. They should, you know, play more and more of a role.
Mark, how has the IMF been responding to the countries in the north, Portugal, Ireland, and these countries that suffered from the crisis? Is it different from the 80s and the 90s when the IMF was highly criticized?
Yeah, well, no, not that much actually. That's where it really is consistent with those policies. It's, but I just want to respond to one thing though on the who controls the IMF, and you know that I think is just it's a little bit misleading because that you have the top 10 shareholders. I mean, the main thing is that you know about 48% of the vote still is the high-income countries, and since they stick together, U.S., Europe, Japan, they've almost never had a
nothing
fight.
Nothing stops the rest from sticking together.
Yeah,
either.
no, theoretically it would be possible for the entire world to organize within the IMF and outvote them, and that's true. Okay, I'll grant you that. But those changes were very small in the voting structure, and the rich countries still control the IMF. But yeah, if you want to say that those countries the other countries are not doing what they're capable of within there, that's true. They don't fight within the IMF the way they fight within the WTO, and that's one of the reasons.
Everybody's institution.
It's one of the reasons they get screwed.
But Mark and Prakash, as we see the crisis unravel, there's a lot of talk about the reemergence of China as a great power and having a lot of control of finances and even bailing out banks in developed countries and so forth. To what extent is this reemergence of China questioning the old patterns and the old ways of doing things at the level of the IMF and the developed countries?
Well, China is definitely having an influence, but it's not anywhere near commensurate even with its economic power or the reserves that it has.
But why?
Because they don't want to. They have this kind of foreign policy slogan from Deng Xiaoping, which is hide brilliance, cherish obscurity. They don't want that kind of a profile. They don't challenge so much. I mean, they'll fight for their interests, but they're not trying to challenge the imperial powers, if you want to call them that, in their spheres of influence. They're having it. I mean, they, as an alternative source of investment, they make a difference. For example, in Latin America, it's becoming significant, but it's slow, and that's why I say, you know, the rich countries, they still control the IMF and the World Bank, and they still have the major power in the WTO and the rules stacked in their favor, and so they still have the disproportionate power, not much differently than they ever had. The difference is that after the Asian crisis, a lot of middle-income countries, especially in Asia and Latin America, also Russia, they just said, you know, we're never going back to the IMF. They piled up reserves, and those countries they're out of the orbit of the IMF. And again, I want to emphasize, the IMF is not an independent organization. It's run by the great powers. Yeah. And so that didn't change after the 2008 crisis.
But Prakash, countries like Jamaica have been coming back to the IMF, and other countries have been coming back. Yeah, Explain to us that process, because about a year ago or so, we thought that the IMF was going to disappear. They were contracting their staff. People were not borrowing money. They said the conditionalities were prescription for riots. What has been responsible for countries going back to the IMF?
I think it's the fact that despite what Mark said, we actually have changed, and I think a lot of countries have come back in many different regions, a lot in Europe, some, as you said, in the Latin America and Caribbean region. We've become more flexible about our policies. We've introduced new...
Where precisely is the flexibility?
Well, we've introduced kind of like a credit line, which is something that many countries had asked for. They said they want a flexible credit line so that we can provide the money and it gives them assurance before a crisis hits. So it's not as though we always rush in once the country is in deep crisis. So a lot of countries have taken advantage of our flexible credit lines.
And the conditionalities that we knew about in the 80s and 90s that were very severe?
Well, if anything, our conditionalities, people are, to some extent, a few governments are complaining about our conditionalities on social spending. I mean, there are cases where in Europe now, we have been the people who have been insisting on saving pro-poor spending, on saving expenditures on health and education. And to the point where some governments have said, yeah, well, look, you, the IMF, you shouldn't be imposing conditionality.
Mark, I see you smiling.
I agree that the IMF has changed slightly. The flexible credit line is a good innovation. However, the last I looked, there were only 3 countries that had that, Colombia, Poland, and Mexico, which happen to be 3 right-wing governments that the U.S. is very partial to. And so I think there's definitely that needs to be expanded. But it's a good idea. But in terms of the IMF doing what it always has done, it's done a lot of that in this crisis. We looked at, in 2009, we looked at the agreements made during the crisis in 2008 and 2009. 41 agreements at that time. 31 of them had pro-cyclical policies, either fiscal, monetary, or both. That means they were countries adopting policies when the economy was weak or in recession, or shrinking, basically, and that went in the wrong direction.
So basically, they
corrected a number of these, and that's where I have these debates with the fund. They say, "Well, we corrected." Well, okay, you corrected it, but you still had 3-6 months, however it took, before the reviews took place, that your projections turned out to be way off, and they had to fix that. So that's one problem. And now you still have in Europe, you have Latvia, you have Greece, Spain, Portugal, Romania, Ireland, all of those countries where IMF is involved, even where they don't have agreements, they're involved in the macro policy decision making. And again, the European Commission and the ECB are the dominant authorities, but the IMF is going along with it. They're putting their name on the agreements, like in Latvia. And these have been a disaster, some of them just as bad, worse than Argentina. Latvia lost 1/4 of its GDP under this program, doing the same thing that Argentina tried to do from 1998 to 2002.
So Prakash, what's your response to that?
I don't think that's an accurate characterization at all. I think, as I said, in some cases, it's been the governments themselves who have wanted to do some kind of fiscal adjustment, and we have tried our best to see whether or not that makes sense or not. In individual cases, as I said, we have actually recommended saving pro-poor spending, social spending. We have actually, in some cases, advocated not having the fiscal consolidation. It all depends on a matter of room. I mean, unlike Mark, I mean, we have to be pragmatic, not dogmatic. We are dealing with lots of different governments, lots of different agencies. As he said, the ECB is in there, the EU is in there. So, I mean, we are just trying to do our best in a very difficult situation. And I think it's the fact that the countries are coming to us is the signal that, of course, it's a deep crisis, and that's why they're coming to us. But also the fact that despite what Mark claims is our track record, I think countries feel that we are helping them out. If you think about Poland's case, I mean, it was the fact that we gave Poland this flexible line of credit that stabilized markets and allowed Poland to actually have a fiscal stimulus.
Now, focusing a bit on the unemployment, can you tell us a bit about what the IMF has been, what kind of dialogue they've been engaging with the International Labour Organization, trade unions, and civil society on the issue of unemployment? What is the state of unemployment globally?
Well, globally, it's a huge crisis. 200 million people, 205 million people around the globe are still unemployed. So there's no sense in which we can say that this recession is over. As I said, our feeling is we should not call the recession over until unemployment starts falling significantly. So it was this state of affairs that led us last year to get together with the International Labour Organization and organize a major conference in Oslo. And as you know, Paul, you participated in some of the workshops that led up to this Oslo conference, and our goal was to focus the world's attention on unemployment, just as the world's attention gets focused on financial developments or inflation. When the stock market plummets, everybody's following the thing day by day. But here you have 205 million people across the globe unemployed, and we have to fight to get the world's attention on this. So that was really our main goal.
Mark,
and that's what we are trying to do.
Yeah, Mark, do you believe this signals a shift from IMF focus on finance to job creation? Or do you believe this engagement with ILO and with civil society and so forth is like a tango dance where at the end it's just a dance and it's over, there's not going to be any real impact? What is your view on this?
I think mostly because the problem is that macroeconomic policy is the most important. What we talked about at the beginning. When an economy is weak, if you care about employment, you have to have demand. Spain has 20% unemployment. What are the European authorities and the IMF doing there? They're pressuring the government to cut spending and raise taxes. The opposite of what we want to do here. You have the European Central Bank. Okay. Again, the IMF is not responsible for all this in the sense that the big decisions are made at the European authorities level, and they do the worst stuff in the Greek agreement, for example, on labor and privatization. That comes from the European Commission. So you can say that's not the IMF's fault. But the IMF's putting their name on it, and they're in there in the negotiations. And so they have to take responsibility for the fact that these countries are being squeezed. Some of them, like Greece, Latvia, they're not Ireland. They're not going to recover their pre-recession level of income for 9-10 years. That's outrageous. Nobody should ever put up with that. There's always a better solution than having a decade of extremely high unemployment and stagnation. And that's what the IMF should be pushing for. But of course, anybody who was running the IMF, like Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who tried to buck the European authorities and the U.S. Treasury, would probably get fired. So that's the problem.
I don't think that's accurate characterization. I think we have been the people who have put out the research and the analytic work that showed the impacts of fiscal consolidation. Last year we had a major piece of research which was cited all over the globe showing what the impacts are on unemployment from fiscal consolidation, showing that unemployment goes up. And on the ground, we are trying to do the best that we can under very difficult circumstances. So I think, and there are numerous cases where we have been in favor of providing fiscal stimulus, or at least cutting, not having as much fiscal consolidation wherever there is room. So I think that there has been a major shift, and I think we should acknowledge the fact that there's a difficult situation and try to work together rather than say, oh, you didn't do as well as you could have.
It seems to me, Mark, that the IMF continues to be a source of controversy about its role, and in your opinion, there's no real paradigm shift. There's
well,
no
the
real
research you
significant
cited, you mean the chapter 3 in the World Economic Outlook? Yeah, I read that. They're always good. But the problem is the policy. The policy doesn't reflect that. At the same time,
I
they're...
don't think that's true. I mean, the policy does.
Well, what is happening in Spain, in Ireland, in Greece, in Portugal right now?
We are taking what our general research shows and then taking it to a specific case and saying, well, does this country have the fiscal space? We've done some very creative work on fiscal space, saying don't equate fiscal space just with the debt to GDP ratio. Look at a country's previous track record. So we are trying to be as creative as we can by saying, look, you have to be flexible about deciding how much fiscal space a country has. But if you have a situation where there just isn't that much fiscal room, it's not.
Then that means you have to restructure the debt. They did this in Argentina. For 4 years, they tried to do what's called an internal devaluation. And what they're doing in Ireland right now, for example, they actually called it an internal devaluation. It's when you squeeze the economy. That's in the IMF Article 4 agreement from July of last year, okay? They call it that. That means you squeeze the economy so much that unemployment rises so much that wages fall, and that's how your economy becomes competitive and recovers through net exports, okay? They tried that in Argentina. It failed, and what happened? Argentina defaulted on their debt, and they grew 63% after shrinking for just 1 quarter.
Well, gentlemen,
Ireland is shrinking for years. It's the 3rd year of a recession.
We have to continue this debate between civil society and the IMF, and to see where the solutions are for the problems and the role of the IMF. I would like to thank you all very much for being program on behalf of Carib Nation, and I look forward to seeing you again. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, continues to be controversial in the 1980s, the 1990s, and now in the 21st century. Will the IMF change, or will the perception of the IMF be changed? We do not know. It seems that in this program, we've had 2 eminent men, one from the IMF, one from civil society, a prominent think tank in Washington, D.C., and we have not come to a consensus. So, in the Caribbean, we continue to listen to the experiences of countries with the IMF with the hope that we will learn and instruct our policies on how we relate to the IMF. I am Paul Niru Tennessee for Carib Nation.